Where's Speed Racer? That'd do it. All right. Exodus chapter 21. Oh, chapter 21, verse 12. Looking at the middle portion of the chapter tonight. Go ahead and read along with me. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. When men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, then, if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. When a man strikes a slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall oppose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes the eye of a slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of a slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. We're going to stop there, just for the sake of space on the handout. Can't go too far too fast. But we're continuing to work our way through the laws that Moses is handed from God after he received, with the people of Israel as a whole, the Ten Commandments. If you remember last week or the week before, or 2 weeks before that, I described these as the covenant code. This is that section of passages that begins in chapter 20, runs through 21, through 22, and into part of 23. This is the covenant code. It's explanations or implications of the Ten Commandments. Because if you think about it, Ten Commandments are really, in one sense, vague. Ten Commandments leave all kinds of room for what-if questions. What about? What do we do when X? What do we do and Y? And so the covenant code, while not exhaustive, is the beginning of the explanations of those what-if scenarios. There'll be more of them in Leviticus. There'll be more of them later. And then, of course, way down the road historically, 700-800 years at least, maybe a little bit more, when the Pharisees are invented, because they're not a biblical organization, they're extra-biblical. When the Pharisees come along, they're part of a system that creates what's known as the oral law, and it's 600 more laws to explain the laws that already existed. And so in one sense, not to defend the Pharisees too far, it's understandable what they were trying to do initially. What do we do about X? Well, I don't know. I've never thought about that. What do we do? You know, one of the things I've discovered as a professor is when I first started teaching, I tried to keep my syllabuses really short. What I discovered is we now live in an America that is Google crazy. Rather than trying to think something through and figure it out for ourselves, what do we automatically do? We ask a question, we Google, we ask the experts. And what students do is they want every word on the syllabus explained. And so rather than 3 and 4 pages, now my syllabuses are 7 and 8, 9 pages long. Because, well, this is what I mean when I said this. This is what this means. That's essentially what we're doing here, is we're taking the law and fleshing it out, putting more meat on the bones so that we can understand how some of these things work. So this covenant code offers some implications of the Ten Commandments. Not all of them, and not always in order. In fact, I'm going to show you tonight Sometimes they bounce around a little bit. The ones we're in now, starting the beginning of chapter 21 last week through 22 and on even into 23, most of these laws relate to what is known as the second table of the law. Remember, I said a couple weeks ago that the Ten Commandments can be arguably organized as two tables. Don't think two tablets, think two tables. But Commandments 1 through 4 are one table. Commandments 5 through 10 are the other table. And I also explained that as you look at the 10, the 4, and then the next 6, as you look at, not only are they divided into two tables, they represent really, in one sense, two different relationships. Commandments 1 through 4 are man's relationship with God. No other gods before me, don't take my name in vain. Second table, all have to do with the issue of man's relationship with who? Man. How do we relate to one another? When are we stealing? When are we doing this? Remember, Jesus does this in the Sermon on the Mount even, doesn't he? Well, you've heard it said. Let me tell you what that means. Last week, when we started into chapter 21, the first of the series of codes that are definitely man-related, because the ones at the end of chapter 20 are related to God, chapter 21 begins with a series of codes that deal with the matter of slaves. And we talked extensively about how it's probably a better way to read that language of slave. Definitely, at the minimum tonight, just to summarize it, don't think of them as American slaves. It's a different kind of concept altogether. Now, this middle section of chapter 21, and really in next week into chapter 21, the very end, all deal with the issue of criminal punishment, especially the section we're looking at tonight as we begin. Somebody criminally violates the law. What's the punishment? Right, so this is the criminal code, if you will. This punishment goes with this crime, and so forth and so on. And the majority of the ones we're looking at tonight, as you were listening along a moment ago, deal with what specifically? Capital punishment. Not all of them. We get to the end, and it's no longer that issue. But for the first part of it, and the majority of the verses we're looking at, it's the question of capital punishment. The ones that we're going to talk about at the end tonight that are not capital punishment related, all are about restitution. If you did this, you've got to pay. So what do you pay? And in fact, when we get into the rest of the chapter next week, there's more of that. What do you do if your oxen gores his oxen? What if your oxen is notorious for doing that? And so either it's going to be the question of capital punishment, when does it apply, when does it not, or a question of restitution. So let's start working our way through these harder ones, starting there at verse 12. Let's look at that first paragraph tonight. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him away from my altar that he may die. And so, the first of these laws is anticipating the crime of homicide, right? Murder. Moving beyond just the simple definition of the word kill, but specifically murder as we might think of it today. And he starts off, just jumps right into it, verse 12, and he says, anyone who murders someone should be put to death. It's a very simple line in the sand he draws here. Anyone who murders someone needs to be put to death. This is not new, even at this point in the Old Testament. As we're reading the Old Testament, there's only one other book before it, and already God's dealt with this once. In fact, those of you who were here a while ago might remember way back in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. God addresses the issue of murder then. So think about it. The ark has come to rest on Mount Ararat. Noah has come out. He's built the altar. He's worshiped God. God's given him the promise of the rainbow. And the first thing God says is if somebody kills somebody, kill that person. And so that's the first indication, isn't it, after the flood, that things haven't been fixed by the flood. Because who's on the boat? Noah and the 7 losers. And what are they going to do before chapter 9's over? He's going to fall down drunk. The one son's going to make a mockery of his dad's nakedness, and it all goes downhill from there. And so Genesis 9:6 has already dealt with the issue of murder. But if somebody wants to go back here real quick and read that for us, I want you to make sure you understand why he's already dealt with this. Genesis 9:6. What is it about murder that makes death or capital punishment fair or just? Go for it. So what's the issue here? It's the image of God. To kill another human, in this sense of murder here, is to diminish, belittle, ignore, undervalue, demean, whatever word you want to put there, the value of the image of God in that person. And thus, it's a sin ultimately not only against the human that you took their life, but who's it a sin really against? It's a sin against God. Because you said they're not valuable regardless of the image of God in them. And so it's this image of God that's there that makes this issue such a big deal. This is why it's a bigger deal than killing a cow. Now we can talk about killing a cow. Is it appropriate or inappropriate depending on certain circumstances? Humans are in a different category altogether. And it's the image of God that makes them so. And so anyone who murders, takes the life of another human, put him to death. That's in keeping with Genesis 9:6. But notice how quickly in verse 13, God nuances the law. Notice how nuanced it is already. This fits something I said several weeks ago when we were in the 10 Commandments. This fits what God is doing with these laws that he's giving them, from the 10 Commandments to the Covenant Code. Remember, I use this word, and I've used it a few times now since. The way these laws are presented, they are what is referred to as casuistic laws. Sort of like casual, only istic. Casuistic. It's a particular type of law. And in casuistic law, remember, they're presented in a kind of an if this, then that kind of pattern. If they do this, then you do that. If this happens, that must happen. And so it's a kind of a sense God presenting these things in a what-if scenario, isn't he? Well, if they do this, here's what you do. But what if they do that? Well, here's what you do here. Paul often argues the same way, doesn't he, in his letters? Paul sets down what he thinks is the truth, and then he begins to respond to hypothetical scenarios. Well, what about, Paul? Well, let me tell you what I think about. Well, what about this? Well, I've got that one too. And so that's casuistic law. And so the first scenario is very simple. If a person murders a person, done deal. Capital punishment. But not every scenario is the same. In fact, verse 13 allows for a very important distinction here. It allows for the distinction between murder and what we would call manslaughter. In other words, God's acknowledged from the get-go, not all sins are equal. Contrary to what we often tell kids in nursery school, right? Well, all sin is sin. Well, if you mean all sin results in death, yes. But does God treat all sins equally? No. And so he's drawing this distinction between murder in verse 12 and what might be termed manslaughter in verse 13. Again, notice how he says it. But if he did not lie in wait for him, in other words, if the opportunity was not planned, but instead God let him fall into his hand, which is an interesting way to say that. That if in God's providence the situation happened, that this ended up this way anyway, but it wasn't planned, that's a different scenario. If that happens, he says, I'll appoint a place for him to flee. And so what God does in this latter case, non-premeditated, and manslaughter, accidental, murder, or accidental, somebody help me here. Accidental death, we've got another legal term for it too, if somebody, negligent homicide, thank you. Yeah, you're at fault. You were drunk, but there's a scenario there. Yeah, it's bad. You accidentally killed that person, but you did kill them. But God says, there's grace here. And did you notice that in the section about capital punishment? The second verse is really about grace. Because God says, in that case, the one who didn't wait and lie in wait, God's going to provide what are referred to as cities of refuge. Cities of refuge, designated cities spread throughout what will eventually be Israel, the nation, throughout the land, where these people in this particular situation can flee to. And there's going to be 6 such cities. In other words, everywhere you're in the land, there's not one that far away. Put this in size context. Israel, the nation, the biggest it's ever going to be is under Solomon. And it wasn't much bigger than the state of Vermont is today. So imagine spreading 6 cities out throughout Vermont saying, if you get in trouble, go there. You can get there in pretty short order. But these are God's gift to these people. Because what's going to happen is if you accidentally kill somebody, you're going to flee there. And you're going to stay there until your trial. So this is not go there and get away with murder. This is flee there until you can actually have a trial. The issue's up for debate. Motive is questioned. The evidence is not entirely clear. So they go there and they wait for the trial. If you're found innocent, you can go home, or you could choose to stay in the city of refuge. Because what happens if you go home sometimes? You get killed and they take revenge anyway. I mean, think about, was it a year and a half ago, we had the shooting right over here at the Cricket? We heard in between Sunday school and church. Kid tried to rob another guy. They both drew on each other, shot each other point blank, both dead. The local kid's family, which lives just across the street, got the address of the man's family who his brother killed. So the kid who started the robbery kills the other guy, he gets killed. His surviving brother gets angry at the other dead guy's family and wants to hunt them down and kill them. So the cities of refuge, if you're found innocent, you can stay there because they cannot come and get you there, ever. If you're found guilty, on the other hand, you can expect what? Death. Back to verse 12. And what God is doing here, ultimately, he's preventing revenge murders. The family can't get even just because they know where you're at. And so it guarantees, or at least guarantees the possibility of, a fair trial. So the law is already nuanced. If this, then that. But what about this? Well, there's that. Verse 14 comes back to the crux of the matter in this first paragraph, and that is, if we want to call it that, intentional murder. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. And so, intentional murders, killings, capital punishment. So we're back to motive and opportunity. Here, specific, I mean, if it wasn't already clear by the what if in verse 13, here it's quite clear that what the author, Moses, has in mind when he writes it, what God has in mind when he gives it, is premeditated murder. It didn't happen, you got in the fight, you lost control, and you accidentally killed him. No, you lay in wait and you ambushed them. These crimes are planned, right? That raises the stakes, even still today, to a whole new level. Because the person who does that, the person who knows what they're doing, makes a plan, executes the plan perfectly, they are knowingly breaking the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. They know what they're doing and they do it anyway. And it's such a person who has no sense of value of human life, who also doesn't even care what God says about it, they're the most dangerous to society, aren't they? You know, we used to say not long ago, somebody who's willing to kill a cop is the person you need to worry about the most. because they recognize no sense of authority. Actually, there's another one, raise the stakes a little bit. God's going to deal with it. Killing a cop's bad, but you can tell a lot about a person by how they deal with people they supposedly love. And so, he's talking about premeditated murder here. They don't care about the sixth commandment. But then he adds something unique here, something that's not even possible yet. Says, if there's such a person as there, and they go into my sanctuary to find sanctuary, and they grab onto my altar, remember, when did the altar just get discussed? Chapter 20. They've not built altars yet, and God's already jumping ahead knowing what they're going to do. These criminals, the ones who've done premeditated murder, even if they go to the sanctuary of the tabernacle or the temple, they're to be arrested and put to death. You can't go hide and go, oops, sorry, safe, right? Ollie, ollie, oxen free, oops, I'm on base. Grabbing the horns of the altar doesn't save you. Now you're going, now who would think of that? Well, there are at least two examples in the Old Testament, in the same book. Adonijah, King Adonijah does it, and Joab did it. And then if you remember, the one king's mother did it also. And they literally had to pry her soon-to-be cold, dead fingers off the altar. And so you can't commit murder, run to the church and say, sanctuary. But how many movies have you seen where characters try to do that? It's because it's in the Bible. People try to do that. And so, God's already working ahead. Can't come into the tabernacle, which will be soon, or the temple several hundred years down the road, and plead innocent because you're in God's house. Now, by extension of that, if we want to apply it into our context, people of faith then also cannot escape temporal punishment for their crimes. The young little enclave here has no clue. Some of you older folks remember Carla Faye Tucker. Remember the name? Carla Faye Tucker murdered. Can't remember if it was her husband she killed or who she killed. She was in jail on death row in Texas. Local pastor went repeatedly to the jail, became a chaplain, led her to Christ. They eventually fell in love, and they get married while she's on death row. When her time finally came up, because we ignore people on death row until right before it's the very end. Now, of course, their lawyers are not ignoring them. They're busy all along, but media ignores them. But all of a sudden it came to light, well, here's this Christian who's now repentant, who's turned her life around. Why should she be killed? And all of a sudden a lot of Christians who would have otherwise been pro-capital punishment, all of a sudden speaking up, not this one. And Carla Faye Tucker's answer was, I murdered somebody, and I must pay the price in this lifetime. I'm forgiven and I'm set for eternity, but there are consequences here and now for my actions. I think if she didn't read it, she certainly would have understood this particular part of the covenant code. Just because you regret it later doesn't take away the consequences of it later. And so consequences follow us sometimes. And so the first one is the clear one about murder. The next several are rapid-fire machine gun approaches to this issue. Verse 15. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. If we need to worry about people who aren't afraid of killing cops, how much more so those who attack their own parents? In fact, it's such a serious crime, God mentions it right after murder. Now we've got two of the 10 commandments at play. You've got the 5th commandment, honor your father and your mother, and you've got the 6th commandment, thou shalt not commit murder. Two of them bound up in this single little short sentence. Now some of you go, wait a minute, why would we kill somebody who strikes their parents? Back to what we were saying right before we started, sometimes the Hebrew does not always translate fully into English. The word strikes is the right word, but in the Hebrew context, strikes means more than just hit. This is not a matter of somebody getting mad at his dad in the heat of an argument and giving dad a black eye. Because sometimes we go, man, this is over the top. Somebody hits his dad and they're going to take him out and kill him. What's in view here when he uses the word strikes is the criminal, and that's what they are in this particular situation. What they intended to do was to inflict death or at least serious injury. So this is not father and son getting into a heated fight, and all of a sudden the son lashes out and hits dad. Dad goes, whoa! This is a son or daughter who intended to kill his or her parents. And if not kill them, they wanted them to hurt forever. And so this is not merely lost my temper, I shouldn't die. No, this is planned disregard, disobedience, dishonor to the parents at the utmost level. So even if they didn't kill him, if it's clear from the trial that was their intent, guess what? That person's of no use to society. In fact, one of the most dangerous people you could imagine. So here's another case where the word doesn't always work for us. That's why if you look back up at verse 12, use the same word there, whoever strikes a man. But remember verse 12, what was the rest of that verse? So that he dies. So this wasn't struck him and accidentally killed him. What was the picture? He intended to kill him. Now, if he intended to kill him and didn't do it, that's different. But if you intend to kill your parents and you didn't do it, we've just gone up a notch. And so, amplitude. The issues, the stakes are getting higher. Verse 16, here's another what if this, then that scenario. Whoever, this is the third whoever in a row now, whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. So, another law in the covenant code, another implication, this time of the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. Now, most of us, when we hear thou shalt not steal, we warn our children, don't go to the store and steal bubble gum. We tell people not to go and embezzle from their employer. God says there are other ways to steal. Some ways that most of us who are innocent-minded enough wouldn't have even thought of. Here, he's talking about the issue that thou shalt not steal humans. Right? Because that's what we're dealing with. Human sins. Relationship with each other. It's bad enough if somebody came and stole your car. Imagine if they came into your house and stole your child. And so we're talking about kidnapping. That's the picture here. Kidnapping is stealing. So you ever hear somebody say, well, there's no law in the Bible against X. Right? We hear that a lot these days about, for example, gay rights. Well, there's no laws against homosexuality. But the laws are written so that the implications are also true. If the implication is undeniable, it applies. Jesus does that again with the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard it said. What's God doing here? Let me throw you an implication you haven't heard of. I said, thou shalt not steal. You probably thought, don't take gold from your neighbor. No, let's raise the stakes. Kidnapping is the stealing of human people. In fact, in this culture, then, and really in America, up until the 1800s, and a lot of the world still, don't let the media beat us up too much. We did change our ways. This is a real problem still elsewhere in the world. The average person who is kidnapped is intended for the slave trade. They would steal people to sell them as slaves. Today in America, we have a sex trafficking problem where that's going on. But around the world, they're still stealing people and selling them as slaves to other people. And so the slave trade is a form of stealing. It's not just merely treating humans bad, it's stealing them. And he adds a caveat, a what if you notice there in verse 16, and anyone found in possession of him. So it's not only the person who kidnapped them who's guilty, And it doesn't simply mean, and this is how some of maybe your English translations do it, that as long as the person has gotten rid of them, they're no longer guilty of it. In fact, one of the older English translations makes it sound like the stealer, the thief, is off the hook if they're no longer in possession, because whoever's in possession. What the law is saying instead is he who stole them, and what else? He who bought them is also guilty of this. How did English, Western, Christianized people in the 16th, 17th, and 1800s justify slave trade? Think about that. Oh, there's examples of it in the Old Testament of people owning slaves. Not if we read the Bible correct. But set aside whether or not you can own them or not. What's clearly forbidden here? Don't take them and don't own them. In one verse, the entire British system of slave trade and chattel slavery is gone. Unless you don't like that conclusion, and so you ignore it and explain it away with something else. That's how our forebears tolerated for some, or excused for others, what went on here for 250 years. Because it's pretty clear, isn't it, what the verse means. Don't steal them, and don't sell them. Don't own them. What's the punishment? Death. Because what have you dishonored? The image of God in that person by treating them like property. Ouch. And it gets harder. Verse 17. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. So, here we are. If you get the handout, there's a typo in this third word there. Returns, not retunes. Verse 17 returns to the fifth commandment again. Back to honoring your mother and your father. Again, we've got to clarify what the Hebrew semantic domain means. Remember that phrase from last week? That the word, one word could have a very nuanced variety of meanings. Curses. Curses the murgatroyd, or heaven's the murgatroyd. Curses. We tend to think of curses as cuss words. For others, they think of curses as witch doctor stuff, right? He put a curse on him. No, and no. They'll all fall within the bigger picture. For the Hebrew, they've got something specific in mind, and it's more than simply verbal abuse. This is not simply yelling at your parents disrespectfully, because in that case, capital punishment would be over the top. So here we got to go, okay, what's clear in the verse? Capital punishment. So now we've got to go, okay, how do we interpret the rest of the verse in light of such a severe punishment? And so curses here has to be more than verbal abuse. Instead, what's prohibited is the ultimate, or if you want to think of the word final, and public dismissal of your parents. You go, okay, that doesn't help me at all. Right now, I envision somebody's going, I'm going to send Dr. Beck a message tomorrow and ask him for the handout because I don't know what he's talking about. But it's the ultimate, final, public dismissal. Think of this. Words are spoken how? Out loud. It's public. So this is something you're saying to or about your parents in a way that everybody's aware of it, and it has an ultimate or finality kind of sense to it. Because what's going on here is the child is essentially wishing his parents were dead. It's that kind of curse. I wish you were dead. Now, the person who says that, what's the next step? Just doing it. You're already halfway home. Now, not every kid who's ever said it really wanted to go there. I get that. But it's this public swearing, cursing of the parents. I wish you were dead. Moreover, and think of Jesus' consternation about this in the New Testament, such a person essentially swears to treat their parents that way until they actually are dead. Right? Isn't that deep down at the heart of honor your father and your mother? We talked about this a few weeks ago. It's not simply obeying. In that culture, what did you do for your parents? They took care of you until what? Until you could take care of them. But later on, the Pharisees come up with a whole bunch of rules that says you have to do that unless. And that's that law, if you remember in the New Testament, of Corban, where you could say, I'm going to give all my money to the temple, Mom and Dad. Sorry. So Mom and Dad are being treated as if what? They're dead. And then there was a caveat in that particular law that you could get out of it later and withdraw your offer to the temple of your money. So it's not only wishing your parents are dead, it's treating them as if they already are. And again, what's the punishment? Death. Now, this one does strike us as, wow, that's a little extreme. But how fundamental or foundational to society is parent-child relationships? This is it. Yeah, this is ground level. Get it right, things go better. Get it wrong, they go bad. What are we learning right now in American society? When you have more single-parent homes than two-parent homes, society begins to fall apart. Not rapidly, not every single-parent home is a disaster. I get that. But sociologists, even the ones who disagree with their conclusions, have to admit what's the conclusion. Especially male children who grew up in a single-parent home tend to do what? Go to jail like 5 times as often as kids who grew up in two-parent homes. Jessica, the kids you work with at school, no names, most of them single-parent or two-parent kids. It's just the way it works. We know it for a fact. And so here's God saying, how serious am I going to take the family relationship thing? I'm going to keep coming back to this one. And it's going to be a big, big deal. Now, the covenant code turns a corner. Let's look at those short little paragraph, verses 18 and 19. When, now notice, no longer a whoever, right? We've had a bunch of whoever statements. Now we're going to several when statements, all the way, in fact, I think to the very end of the chapter. When men quarrel, not if, when men quarrel, and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die, but takes to his bed, then, if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be clear. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time, and shall have him thoroughly healed. And so, remember, if this, then that. We've dealt with, here's what happens if you premeditate versus if you accidentally. Now, we're still talking about violence done to man, but now we're talking about violence that does not lead to death. So, Moses, are we supposed to kill everybody who attacks somebody? No. Violence that does not lead to death requires a different punishment. Remember, God is just. And so, here's the nuanced case. In this particular case, the victim, either hit with a rock or with a fist or any other thing you want to add in there, doesn't limit it just to those two instruments. The victim is injured. In fact, he's sent to bed for a while. He's injured, but he's not killed. So he lives. And so, because he lives, the offender, the one who did it, is going to be spared death. And don't we do the same thing in our modern criminal law codes? If you hit somebody and killed them, this is one type of trial you're going to face, son. If you hit them, but they survived, you're going to have a different charge against you, son. Or think of all the movies you saw, Bad News, Son, the guy you hit last night died. What's that? The subtle way of telling the person, we're about to throw the book at you. So here we are, case law. Victim survives, offender survives also. Yet, he doesn't just walk away and go, "Ooh, that was close." Instead, under the covenant code, he has to compensate his victim for their time lost. You lost your job. I got to pay your wages. You lost your crop because you couldn't work for 3 months, so you lost your income from that. I've got to cover that. Your family can't pay their rent. I've got to cover that. Today, and I think it's even implied pretty clearly here at the end of verse 19, today we would add medical expenses to this, wouldn't we? Because in fact, what's he say? You got to help them heal. So you are responsible. Just because they live doesn't mean your troubles are over. It just means your punishment is proportionate. And so, if then this. Verses 20 and 21. When a man, there's that when again, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. So we've already dealt with attack, near death, but survived. Now, he has in mind two things intertwined here. The first one to notice is when a man strikes a slave, corporal punishment is part of the system, isn't it? If the slave has done something worthy of it, they're to be punished. And so we've moved from capital to corporal. But notice what's going on here. The owner, the master, whatever word you want to use there, the employer, is striking his slave, taking a rod to him. So he is being punished corporally, but he accidentally kills the slave during this process. So he let his anger get the best of him. He went too far. Couldn't stop, didn't stop, wouldn't stop, whatever. Slave's dead. If the slave dies under what should have been a minor punishment, it is now raised from simply the master was doing what was right to the master is now going to be charged with murder. And he'll pay with his life for killing a slave. Now again, throw out our American context. In our American context, what did we do with slaves? Treat them like property. If they died, they died. In fact, if they survive long enough to do the job, that's all I want. Same thing with the slave traders. The tales are gruesome, what they did to get the slaves here, get them sellable, and then the owner would take them home, undo what the slave trader did, and they'd sometimes die in days. And it's not worth putting on audio here, but it's nasty. That's premeditated, isn't it? It's planned. You planned to hit them. Now, you may not have planned to lose your temper and hit them too many times or too hard, but you planned to do it. You planned the hitting, the beating. And so you're to be treated as though you were guilty of premeditated murder. If the slave survives, no punishment is required because the slave is the one who deserved the punishment. And since he or she lived, there's no permanent harm done or intended. Near miss, scary scenario. Whew. But notice, the slave is to be treated like what? No, the opposite. Like a person. A full person. You kill them, you die. You don't own them. Remember our scenario last week. They essentially work for you. You abused a human in the image of God for personal gain. You're dead. If they survive, we move on. Also notice there, by the way, he reiterates twice in those two verses, male or female. So this is not a gender issue either. The next paragraph is a little more complicated again. When men strive together, and it doesn't mean work together. Think of the word struggle here instead. When men strive together and they hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Some of that's pretty straightforward, cut and dry. Some of that is up for debate. The meaning of the scenario as he unfolds, right? Men are struggling together, and they hit a pregnant woman, and something happens. That's where the debate is. What scenario is being described here? This one's really hard. This is not one of those ones where, oh, this kind of theologian does it this way, and this kind of theologian does it that way. All Hebrew theologians are going to admit this one's a tough one. Because this phrase, striking a woman when she's pregnant and her children come out, then that's really where the struggle is. When it says when her children come out or cause her children to come out, that phrase is used nowhere else in the entire Old Testament. It's one and done. So we can't go to another verse that's clearer and go, oh, that's what this must always mean, like we can with the word slave or servant or some other things. This is a one-time phrase, and you go, man, what is going on here? And so various people have tried to apply it differently. If she gets hit accidentally during this struggle between the men, question is, did she miscarry? Right? They hit her and they caused her children to come out. You could argue that's a miscarriage. And so if they hit her and she has a baby prematurely but didn't miscarry, the law doesn't apply. See how important it is we discern what it is that's being described? So, did she miscarry is one way to interpret that. You could also interpret it differently and say, this is a question of whether or not she delivered prematurely. Did she go into labor early? She got hit. It was an emotional, traumatic moment. She went into labor and had the babies prematurely. Now they're in the NICU for 8 weeks. That's a different scenario than causing her to have the baby die. Think of the struggles right now in American law. You can get an abortion, depending on where you're at, up until the last possible minute. It's just a lump of flesh. But if you accidentally kill a woman who's pregnant, they can actually charge you with 2 murders. Think about that one. But that's the confusion that comes with interpreting the scenario. So if she's miscarried, that's one scenario, in which case if she doesn't miscarry, the baby survived, you're off the hook. Depends on what the passage means. Third way you can go with it is, did she somehow lose the ability to have children because of the wound? Right? And we know that can happen sometimes. That something can happen to the woman and she's forever barren thereafter. And so, well, this is that case law kind of thing. If she has a miscarriage, here's the punishment. Okay, what if she delivered prematurely? So see the difficulty here? We don't know exactly what it means, cause their children to come out. We know that she's an innocent victim, wrong place, wrong time. Something happened to her maternally, one of those several options I mentioned, and there were long-lasting consequences to those events. What is clear when you read this paragraph is what comes at the end, the eye for the eye, tooth for tooth, and so forth. What is clear is that the punishment must fit the crime. Yeah, it's one thing to accidentally cause a woman to become sterile. It's horrible. It's not a preferable situation, but it's a different thing than if you killed her baby in her womb. You would treat it differently. That's what's in view here. And again, the idea is the punishment is just. It's not over the top, but it's also not weak-kneed and hamby-pamby either. And so the best we can do here is punishment fits the crime. One more quick paragraph before we're done. Verse 26. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of the tooth. Notice we're going now in descending severity of the situations, just like the Ten Commandments seem to go down in severity of the scenario. And so if the last one was the punishment's got to fit the crime, same thing is going to be then true of non-lethal crimes committed against slaves. Right? Some of the lowest people in society, same principles apply here. Just like you can't kill a slave just simply because you're angry, you can't get away with maiming the slave either. Put out his eye, he goes free. Knock out his tooth, he goes free. Using our analogy from last week, this slave or employee must be compensated for the harm done. Right? This is the whole thing about workman's comp, isn't it? To protect the employee from being dumped or mistreated or not getting their wages covered or their insurance covered when they got hurt at work. Your machine, your situation, whatever, negligence, caused damage to this person. You are responsible for that damage. You can't get rid of them just because they're going to hurt your insurance rates. Good way to get yourself sued, isn't it? Same concept here. Even if it's a slave, if you've done something to hurt their viability, something to hurt their livability, something to hurt their ability to make money for themselves in the future, you've got to pay. In this case, the payment is they go free and you lost your investment. But the concept is punishment fits the crime. You cause the damage, you've got to make it right. And so we've gone from capital punishment, references to corporal punishment, but through it all, these if this, then that kind of scenarios are all about what ifs. Yeah, the law says don't steal. Wow, I never thought about kidnapping. The law says don't do this. Well, I never thought about that. And so here's God going, don't try to play the letter of the law on me. You all know what I'm talking about? Well, the law says don't do that. How many of you told your kid to quit touching the other kid? Quit touching your brother, Joe Marsh. So what does Joe Marsh do?
Get as close as he can without.
Joe knows because Joe did this. Mom and Dad freak. They pull over. Joe Marsh gets corporal punishment. We get back in the car and Joe does it again because Joe is denser than the average bear. But it's the issue, isn't it? If you want to play letter of the law, there's a lot of stuff we could get away with. But if you go to what's the spirit of the law, all of a sudden it gets a whole lot harder. And this is, by the way, again, as I've said several times now, this is what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, and he's referencing usually the Pharisees' interpretation of the Ten Commandments. Let me tell you what it meant. If you've looked at your brother with anger in your eyes, you've already killed him. That's the idea of cursing your parents. If you look at a woman with lust in your eyes, you've already committed adultery. It's the heart issue, not the action issue. And so, good warning for us. So, next week we'll continue on through chapter 21 and hopefully wrap up the end of it. Keep plowing forward into the rest of the covenant code as we move now downhill. We're over halfway done with the book. And it only took us a year to get here. Probably take us about a year to get to the end. But we're making good headway. But let's go ahead and pray. Get out of here. Stay safe if it starts raining you on the way home. If not, go home, enjoy the sound of the storm as it goes overhead, and pray that God watches over and keeps us all. But let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for your goodness, your mercy. We ask, Lord, that you would be with us, guide us, Lord, protect us, but Lord, more importantly, sanctify us. Use us, Lord, to glorify yourself. And Lord, work through us to reach and touch others, that we might be agents of good rather than agents of evil. And Lord, in it all, may people be drawn to Christ. First, in his name we pray, amen.